I feel like every day I become more convinced that there's a lot of truth in the common phrase, more than meets the eye. You've heard this phrase before. It's something that we say on a regular basis. I think in any given situation, what you can see with your eyeballs is probably about half, maybe even like a quarter of what's going on beneath the surface. You even take a room like this. Like a cynic would look at this room, and on the surface it looks like a number of high schoolers who are all looking in the same direction, and they're here to worship God and learn about Jesus and grow as kingdom workers and all these different things. But a cynic would look at this and say, that's really not what's going on. There's more than meets the eye. What's really going on is you got a bunch of kids who are distracted by things going on back home, whether it's painful things or joyful things, distracted by other things in the room. Maybe they spotted somebody that they're interested in getting to know. Maybe they're more concerned with what other people think of them than what they're actually doing, all those different kinds of things. But that's not what I see when I look at the room. That's not what I see when I look at you. When I look at this room, I see opportunity. When I look at this room, I see potential. When I look at this room, I see some stories that are in the process of being written, and who knows where they go from here. You know, the world's story moves forward because significant things happen in individual moments, and yet the individual moments that change everything, from the outside looking in, look an awful lot like the rest of the moments. There's nothing obviously special about some of these times that we look back on and recognize this is when the world was changed. There's this old Roman poet that said, things are not always as they seem. You've heard this before. The first appearance may be deceiving. Think about an event from the time of this Roman poet, Theodorus. Are you guys familiar with the name Julius Caesar? You guys know who this is, yeah? Lived a long time ago, kind of the first leader, if you will, of the Roman Empire. Well, in 49 BC, Julius Caesar is standing at this river called the Rubicon River, and he's got a few thousand troops behind him, and he leads his troops, after saying the die is cast, he leads his troops across this river into Italy. Now, this was a pregnant moment because he had been stationed up north of Italy, and the Republic, the Senate back in the middle of the city, had actually become concerned about his growing power, and so they told him he needed to disband his legion of soldiers and return to Italy alone. He wasn't so much trusting what was going to happen if he did this, and so he decided to return to Italy in a little bit of a different fashion. And he led his troops, defying the order of the Senate, across the Rubicon River into the Empire of Rome, into the actual territory of Rome, and in doing so, he declared war on the country that he had given his life for, and he essentially became a traitor of the state. Now, this is a moment that actually led to this civil war and then resulted in the establishing of the greatest empire that the world has ever known, even to this day. And yet, if you and I were just sort of like there, if we were over on the side hiding under some bush watching this take place, it wouldn't look that impressive. It would just look like a bunch of big, burly dudes that probably don't smell very well wading across a shin-deep stream. There's more than meets the eye. Are you guys familiar with, have you guys seen Stranger Things Season 3? Any of you guys in here seen it? Some of you have. A lot of you have. Okay. I won't ruin it, I promise, but it's like at the beginning of the season, you got Billy, the town bully, but he's also this bodyguard that all the old women are into. It's kind of really strange. And yet he's like made this appointment with Mrs. Wheeler, which is creepy. And yet he's driving along this road, and he's looking in the mirror, and he's planning out his conversation. And it is very odd and creepy, but it's kind of not all that out of the ordinary for who this character is. And then boom, something happens. I'm not going to tell you what in case you've not seen it, but it just looks like a normal moment. And yet this is about to be the moment that makes the season, that turns the story into what the story will be. There's more than meets the eye. There's also more than meets the eye in the story that we're going to be reading and studying together this morning. If you have your Bibles, open them up to 1 Kings chapter 17. Now, some of you know easily how to do this. To turn your Bible to 1 Kings 17 is no big deal. I want to acknowledge, though, that some of you in the room are new to the Bible. Maybe you just became a follower of Jesus. Maybe you're not a follower of Jesus. You're just checking this out. Or maybe you've been in the church for a while, but you're not sure what to do. I just want to take a minute here and say it's okay if you don't know how the book works. You'll figure it out eventually. It's divided into different parts. There's like the first half is the Old Testament. That's what we're studying, and it prepares the world for the coming of Jesus. And then the second part is the New Testament. That tells us about Jesus' coming and how to follow him. And we're studying a portion of the Old Testament. Now, it's divided into these individual books, and the books are divided into chapters, and the chapters are divided into verses. So when you look up on the top of the page, you see a name like 1 Kings, 1 Kings. That's the book, and then chapter 17 and the verses. If you don't know where to find it, just look in the table of contents, find 1 Kings, or look over at your neighbors, ask them for a little bit of help later on. We're going to look at the story that follows what Brad was talking about in that video, 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 24. I'm going to read all of it through. Here's what it says. Then the word of the Lord came to him, that's Elijah, after the brook dries up and there's no more water. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and did as Elijah had told her, so there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. And for the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, what have you against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Give me your son, Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. And then he cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, look, your son is alive. And then the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. This is a crazy story. There's a couple of different ways that you can take this story. You could take this story as something strange. This is something out of the ordinary. This is not something that happens every single day, where there's sort of this cupboard of oil and flour, and you just keep using it, but it just keeps replenishing like magic style. Like, this is wizardry. This is weird. This is not the kind of thing that you and I have probably experienced. You could take this story as an account of something strange, something out of the ordinary. I remember just as I was thinking through this text, I actually found some other stories about similar things taking place, and they're always really cool and meaningful when people show up at the last minute with food, and there it is, and nobody was expecting it, and yay, God. And I thought about sharing some of those stories, but one, we don't really have time, and two, I don't know that it would be that helpful for us. It's an understandable thing. If you take the story as being something out of the ordinary, then the result is you wonder, I wonder if God will ever do this kind of thing for me. I wonder if I will ever see something this crazy. It's a natural response to what we're reading, but what if when we do this with 1 Kings 17, what if we totally miss the point? You see, the second way to take this story is to see this event as something normal, as something ordinary. Like, what if the point of this story is not, look at this crazy thing God did one time, or look at this crazy thing God does sometimes, but instead, what if the point of this story is, just notice what God is always doing? Now, how could this be ordinary? Because it doesn't happen every day. Well, that's kind of how miracles work in the Bible. The point of the miracles isn't to point to themselves, it's to point to deeper truths. It's a visible demonstration of something that's always taking place, but usually it's invisible. Kind of microwaves the process of what God does. So you think about when Jesus calmed the storm. It was impressive for sure, and it was designed to show his power, but it was also designed to show this is what Jesus is doing with the world, bringing peace to our chaos. You think about when Jesus healed this young girl from death. She was dead, and then she was alive again. It's like, this is great for her, but it's not just this was great for her. It's, look at this picture of what Jesus can do for all of us if we put our faith in him. In the Bible, miracles are always designed to reveal some invisible truth, and I think that that's the same thing happening in this. I think this is an indication of what God is doing all the time. Let's just focus in on one detail from this story. the bread. Did you notice that bread plays a significant role in this story? Like, why bread? It's not even fancy. Like, it smells quite good, actually. But it's just bread. Bread is about as ordinary as you can get. So you take a little bit of flour and you take a little bit of oil, maybe some water, and you kind of throw them together and you got bread. And yet some of life's deepest secrets are hidden here. Like, why biscuits? You know what I'm saying? Like, it's crazy to think that the secret to life is found in a baguette. But what if it's true? Like, what if bread can teach us something? It wouldn't be the first time. You guys know, I don't know if you know the name Malcolm X. Do you know who Malcolm X is? He was a leader of the black community during the civil rights time, around the same time as Martin Luther King Jr. They knew each other, and they weren't enemies, but they weren't exactly best buddies either, because they had different strategies and convictions, and Martin Luther King was very, very patient, and he was all about nonviolence, and it was very, very sort of a kind of a sweet presence and working with those who disagreed with him. Malcolm X was not that kind of a leader. He was loud, and he was intense, and he was hostile, and he was in your face, and it was just a different style of doing things. And I read earlier this summer, I read the Autobiography of Malcolm X, super fascinating book, about 400 pages. And on page 8, he tells a story of a time when he learned that being loud makes a difference in the world. It's early on in his life. He's a young boy. He's growing up near Detroit, and he's got a lot of brothers and sisters, and they don't have very much money at all. And he talks about how during that time period, his older siblings would come home from school. He wasn't old enough to go to school yet. They'd come home from school, and his mom would be making buttermilk biscuits for dinner that evening and breakfast the next day. And his older siblings would come in hungry after school, and Mama, can I have a biscuit? And they'd be like, no, get out of here, go. And they'd go out of the kitchen, leave. But Malcolm would see this, and he wanted a biscuit, and so he just kept pestering his mom, Mama, give me a biscuit, Mama, give me a biscuit, over and over and over again, until eventually his mom would relent and give him a biscuit. And she would say to him often, like, why can't you be like your older brother, so nice, so patient? And he's thinking to himself, and why would I want to be like him? Like, yeah, he's nice, and he's patient, and he's also hungry. He says, I learned at a very early age that if you want something in life, you got to make some noise. And he learned this lesson from bread. Without bread, there is no Malcolm X. Now, you can disagree with his policies and convictions, but the man made a difference. Without bread, there is no Elijah. I mean, bread is actually talked about a lot in the Bible. You know bread is mentioned 366 times in Scripture? That's like a piece of toast for every day on the calendar, even on leap year. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's a lot of bread. And it shows up in important moments. When Israel is making her way through the wilderness, into this land that God has promised, and she's hungry, and she asks God for something, and God gives them this manna. Well, what is manna? Well, it's like this bread that comes every day, just enough for today. That's it. Can't save for tomorrow, just for today. You look at the life of Jesus and the amount of times that bread shows up. Jesus is being tempted in the desert at the beginning of his ministry, and he's tired and he's hungry, and the enemy comes to him and says, hey, why don't you turn these stones into bread? You think about later on in his ministry when he's teaching his people how to pray, and he says, here's what you should pray on a regular basis. Give us this day our daily bread. You think about the time whenever he had to feed 5,000 plus people, and all he had was 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. You think about the Last Supper, when he's talking about his own death, and he takes this piece of bread and he breaks it, and he says, this is my body that's given for you. Bread. Look at the details in our text. I don't know if you noticed, but there's no meat in our text. Now, in the event that Brad was just talking about, when the ravens would come and feed Elijah just before what we read, they would bring him on a daily basis. They would bring him, and it specifically says bread and meat, and they would do it twice a day. This is a meal right here. And yet when you get to Zarephath, when you get to the widow's house, when you get to 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 and following, there's no more meat. It's just bread. Because bread is essential for life. Without bread, you're dead. Like, that's how it works. Bread is a symbol in this text and in so many others of life. Life is woven throughout the story of Elijah. I'm not sure if you'd have picked it up yet. Just flip again. Look again at 1 Kings 17. Life is running all the way through this thing. Verse 1, as soon as he shows up on the scene, Elijah says, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Then verse 12, when he's talking to this woman, as surely as the Lord, or when the woman is talking to him, as surely as the Lord your God lives. I'm about to go home and bake a meal. Later on in this verse, I'm about to go home and make a meal for myself and my son, and then we're going to die. Flip ahead, after things happen and the bread is there, but then the son gets sick, she actually comes to Elijah because the son's passed away, and she says, like, what in the world are you doing? Verse 18, what have you done? What have you against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? And then Elijah does this weird, like, stretching out over the boy multiple times, and then he says to God, Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him. Next verse, the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived, and he takes this boy to his mom and says, look, your son is alive. Life is all over this story, because this story is ultimately not about miracles. It's not about bread. It's about a question. Will God provide life? Can God be trusted to give us what we need? This is literally the oldest question there is. This was the question facing Eve in the Garden of Eden. She's there with Adam, and they've got the animals, and they've got the food, and they've got everything that they could possibly need, right? And there's this one tree that they're not supposed to eat because God said don't eat, or you're actually going to die. Like, stay away from that tree. And then there's this voice that comes from within the garden, comes from the serpent. And literally the words are, did God really say? But what's he actually asking? Are you sure that you can trust him? Are you positive that he's not holding out on you? And she wonders, and she sins. Sin, evil always begins, disobedience always begins with the suspicion that God can't be trusted. It always starts with this thought that maybe God is holding out on me. Maybe he's not providing me with everything that I need. This is the question that's facing the Israelites in the time of Elijah. They've got two options. You heard them. They can worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, who's revealed himself in all sorts of powerful ways, or they can worship Baal, the god of their neighbors. Now, Baal, you might know, is a fertility god. Now, that doesn't just mean you can have a lot of babies if you worship him, although that's part of it. It's more like if you worship Baal, then you'll have what you need. Your crops will produce fruit. The skies will produce rain. You will be provided for. And they're wrestling with this question of who is it that we should trust? And this is the question that's facing you and me today. Do you trust God to provide everything you need? If you do, then doing what he said will be automatic. Whether it's a matter of, ethics, how you live your life, or mission, what you do with your life. If you trust that he'll provide everything you need, then it won't be hard. I remember just a couple of years ago, I was at an event much like this one, and I was talking to this young girl, and we'll call her Danielle, and she came up to me, and she's a very honest young lady, and she talked about, why does God have such a problem with me sleeping with my boyfriend? And I remember talking through her and kind of presenting the biblical evidence and talking about general wisdom and all the things that we could learn, but I knew it wasn't resonating with her. And I just kind of stopped and said, like, what's going on? Like, I don't think that this is connecting. And she said, yeah, well, I'll be honest, we're actually already sleeping together, and I don't want to stop. And I said, why don't you want to stop? And she said, well, because if I stop, then I'm pretty sure that he will leave me, and I don't necessarily think that him leaving me is a good idea. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, the issue isn't what does the Bible say? I think you know that. The issue is, do you trust God to provide you with everything you need, or do you not? I don't know where she went from there. I remember just a couple of years ago at this event, I was talking to a young man. I'll call him Aaron because I don't know, he might be in the room. And he was wrestling with what he should do with his life. He was finished with high school, and he's thinking about the future, and he's wrestling. Should I don't know what career, like, if he's going to be a mechanical engineer, but he's wondering, like, maybe I should actually be a pastor. I'm just wrestling with God's call on my life, and I'm very careful in those moments to not try to press people beyond what I know. God doesn't tell me what other people are supposed to do with their lives, but I just encourage them to listen to his voice. And I said, there's all sorts of ways you can serve Jesus. You can do kingdom work as a mechanical engineer just as much as you can as a pastor, man. It's about faithfulness to your calling. But as the week went on and we continued to talk, it was clear that, like, God wasn't leaving this kid alone. And this particular young man, I'm pretty sure that God was calling him to ministry. And I said, listen, man, like, it's not my place to tell you what Jesus wants. Like, I'm going to tell you to obey, but I'm telling you, here's what I see. I think this is what he's asking you to do. Do you trust him? And he started to talk about, well, I don't know how much money I'm going to make, and I don't know if I'm going to sort of get the prestige and status that I want. And I remember I actually got an email the next week from his mom. She wasn't very happy with me because she didn't want him to be a pastor either. I said, listen, ma'am, I'm just trying to get this kid to listen to the Lord and to trust him. And I don't know what he decided to do with his life, but I know where he was leaning in that particular moment. And it wasn't an avenue that was marked by a conviction that God will provide with everything we need. What you think about God is the most important thing about you, even if you don't care about him right now. I get it. Some of you don't care about him right now, but what you think about him is the most important thing about you. And this may be the critical point. Like, do you believe that he will provide you with what you need? don't answer the question too quickly. We often answer too quickly. Well, yeah, duh. Like, this is your secret? This is the thing that you came to say that God provides? Some of y'all are like, I've been learning that since I was a kid. Like, you learned the prayer when you were just little. God is great, God is good. Let us thank him for our food. God provides. Everyone knows that if God is real and that if he's anything like what Jesus says he is, then he provides what we need. Does everyone know that? Do you? And if you do, then why is it not easier to you to do what he says? You know, my favorite children's book is called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. You'll have to forgive me, I am a dad. And I won't read the whole book to you, but I think it's actually fairly profound. And it tells the story of this kid, Billy Bixby. And he shows up one day and he looks at the end of his bed. He wakes up in the morning and there's a dragon on the end of his bed. It's just a cute little thing about the size of a house cat. And he goes downstairs and he says, Mom, there's a dragon on my bed. And his mom says, Billy, there's no such thing as a dragon. And so he goes back to his room and there's the dragon, but he figures, well, I guess it's not really real, so I might as well not pay attention to it. And things go on, and he's obviously looking at the dragon, and she's obviously looking at the dragon, but she doesn't want to acknowledge that the dragon is real, and it becomes a little bit of a problem. Like one day the dragon eats all of Billy's pancakes. Brutal. Every time the dragon goes to sleep, it grows. And it grows to the point where it's like filling the house, and the mom's trying to clean, but she has to go inside and outside to work around this thing. And it continues to grow, and at one point it grows so large that its neck is standing out the front door and its tail is standing out the back door. And then it wakes up one day and it smells a bakery truck going by, and that smell of bread just gets him. So he just starts walking after this truck, taking the house with him, just on his back. Mailman sees this, says, I don't know where this is going. Dad comes home from work later that day, the house is gone. Thankfully, a neighbor said it goes that way. He walks over and sees the house and climbs up on the dragon's neck and sits in the house up on the upstairs floor with his wife and his son. And they're just sitting there looking around, and the mom still refuses to accept that the dragon is real. And Billy's fed up with this. So finally he says, Mom, there is a dragon. And she reluctantly agrees. And as soon as she agrees, that thing starts to shrink. Takes the house back to where it belongs, continues to get smaller and smaller until once again he's the size of a house cat. Now, by this time in the story, everybody in the town agrees on two things. Number one, dragons do exist. And number two, they're much more manageable when they're the size of a house cat. And on the last page of the book, the mom says, why did he have to get so big? And Billy says, well, I don't know. Maybe he just wanted to be noticed. Can we just notice together right now that sometimes trusting God is hard? Can we just be honest with one another and acknowledge that it's not always easy for us to believe that God will provide everything we need? Can we admit that even for us who say we believe, sometimes it's tough, sometimes it's hard? Like, sure, if God is real and if Christianity is true, then he'll provide everything we need. We can trust him no matter what. But those are some extra large ifs. I mean, it's just bread. Maybe. Or maybe there's more here than meets the eye. God will provide everything you need for well-being, for happiness, for life. Is this something you believe? Is he someone you trust?